Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you all had a magnificent Thanksgiving holiday last week. Before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to drop a quick note. One of the subjects for the episode you're about to hear is the storyline CAMELOT Falls, written by Kurt Busiek and drawn by Carlos Pacheco. Of course, Carlos Pacheco sadly passed away earlier this month on November 9th, 2022. We recorded the episode you're about to hear long before his passing. In fact, we recorded it a few months ago. So I just wanted to let you know, as you were listening to the episode, that's why we are speaking of Carlos Pacheco in the present tense and not making reference to his passing or prior illness. I just wanted to give everyone a heads up about that before you dive into the episode. I opted not to re-edit or re-record the episode because I wanted to present it as originally intended and recorded. But I just wanted to give everyone a heads up about that. More importantly, I wanted to take this opportunity to express my sincere condolences to the family, friends, collaborators, and fellow fans of Carlos Pacheco. Like so many of you, I was very saddened to hear first of the news of his illness, and then, of course, of his subsequent passing. Of course, we do speak about Carlos Pacheco in the episode, and we speak very highly of him and his tremendous, glorious art. As you know, if you're a regular listener of the show, we do tend to focus more on the writing side around here. So I'm sure as you're listening and as I re-listen to the show, we'll be thinking, oh, should have said more about just what a tremendous talent he was, and in particular in that story, CAMELOT Falls. But the best way, I suppose, to remember him, at least from the fan perspective, right, is to enjoy and celebrate the work. And so even though the timing, this was not, of course, what was the original intention when we recorded this episode, but to whatever extent this episode can serve as any sort of tribute, just as when we did our episode after this passing of Tim Sale, to whatever extent that we can honor these creators by celebrating their work that will always live on and will be there for us to revisit and for new fans to discover. To whatever extent we can do that, I'm happy to do that. So I really hope that you enjoy this episode. We talk not just about CAMELOT Falls, we also talk about the Black Ring storyline written by Paul Cornell and drawn by Pete Woods. My guest is Chris Clow from the Comic Binge and Discovery Debrief podcast. He's a first-time guest on this show. If you've been listening to my other show, another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, I hope you have been listening. Chris was a guest on one of the early episodes there. We talked about the case of the talkative dummy from season 1, but this is his debut appearance on Digging for Kryptonite. Again, it was a pleasure to kind of shine a little bit of a light on CAMELOT Falls and Black Ring. Not that they're so under the radar here, but it has been a minute since those stories came out, and I don't know how often they're necessarily in the conversation these days. And it was great to be able to, again, have that discussion and shine a little bit of a light on them. So again, I just wanted to take this opportunity to share all of that with you. Again, express my condolences. And now share with you this episode that we recorded a few months ago on CAMELOT Falls and the Black Ring. I hope you enjoy. My journey as a Superman fan started with a tattered red cape blowing in the wind. That ending rocketed me forward like a red-blue blur through a decade-long origin story and poignant tales of self-discovery and now fatherhood, and backward to the character's very beginnings. Now, on this podcast, we journey together across time and media to examine the stories that have defined the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman CAMELOT Falls by Kurt Busiek and Carlos Pacheco, as well as The Black Ring by Paul Cornell and Pete Woods, is podcaster and first-time guest, Chris Clow. Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Anthony. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here and to talk about the world's greatest hero.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that we could connect for this. I guess we have to give a shout out to our mutual friend, Zach Moore from the Always Hold On to Smallville podcast. He had us on his show not too long ago to talk about the season 7 episode of Smallville Persona featuring Smallville's version of Bizarro. So that was the first time that we met and we got to talk Superman, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Oh no, it's always good to be able to jump on Zach's show, and he's a little bit of a kingmaker of his own. So it was cool to be able to jump on that with the both of you guys. And talking comics is just one of my absolutely favorite things to do. So much appreciated.
Well, speaking of talking, podcasting, comics, What are the shows that you are involved with that folks might want to check out?
Sure. So currently, right now, my primary show is Discovery Debrief, which is a Star Trek podcast, and basically me and three other fans get together and talk about all of the new episodes that are coming out because there's a lot of new Star Trek that's coming out, and we've just finished up Strange New World season 1, which is a fantastic show that kind of harkens back to the original series. And then I occasionally show up on episodes on the Batman Podcast Network with my buddy Ryan Haas. And my friend Paul Herman and I have a regular YouTube weekly show called The Comic Binge, where we dive into a bunch of different story arcs and just try and communicate our love of the medium to as many people as we can. And we're actually in the middle of a binge right now that kind of deals with the lead up to Infinite Crisis, and then we'll jump into the main series and weave through some of the tie-ins there, and then we'll jump into 52, the weekly series. So we got a lot of DC around this era. So one of the stories that we're going to talk about fits right in there, which is just I've been talking a lot about like 2006, 7, 8 DC comics. So this will be fun. It's already kind of in my head.
Oh, that's perfect. That really dovetails nicely. Yeah, I was so happy that you were keen to do these stories when I reached out to you. And both of them fall within that post-Infinite Crisis, pre-Flashpoint era of DC Comics and Superman. And interestingly, I mean, these stories effectively bookend the New Krypton saga. Camelot Falls comes right before, very shortly before New Krypton, and then Black Ring is right after. I will admit, I still have not read the entirety of the New Krypton saga. At the time, back in the day, I had read the first few installments, and then I always intended to go back to it. And I do intend to get to it for the podcast. And for anyone who's really been paying close attention, I know I've said that we were going to get to it this year along with the Krypton TV series. We just had so much to cover. So we're going to push that to next year. But we are still getting to the New Krypton saga and to the Krypton TV series. But that was one of the reasons why I thought these stories would be cool to talk about, because at least they're dealing with that same period. And again, kind of get you, going into and coming out of that storyline.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. But honestly, too, your experience with New Krypton also seems to be the experience of DC editorial, because they spent like several years building that up as the thing that was going to drive the titles for at least a couple of years going forward. And then it ended so abruptly and quickly. And you consider the journey that the titles went through across a bunch of different writers, and it all kind of just ended up funneling into a single month, one issue that came out per week in May of 2010 to finish the whole thing off is a very strange kind of occurrence. I feel like they did an okay job of sticking the landing, but I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about it when you get around to it, because I haven't revisited it since it came out.
This is probably more of an off mic question, but I guess my question is how worth it is it? Because I will admit it was a little daunting. I pulled up the New Krypton page on the DC app.
Oh boy.
and it's over 100. It's just over 100 issues across the various titles. I mean, that's a bit of a haul. Do you think it's, from what you remember of it, I know you haven't gone back to it, but is it worth that much time, I guess?
Well, I mean, considering how dedicated you are to unpacking Superman, for you, I do think it's probably worth the time and effort. If you were just kind of randomly looking for something to read on DC Universe, I would be more reticent to recommend it, just because the stuff that led up to it was really good. You had Jeff Johns that made a statement on Action Comics even before the first story that we're going to talk about. But he was also an architect of New Krypton. And then he brought in James Robinson. And from what I understand, James Robinson didn't realize that he wouldn't have access to Superman while he was writing the main monthly title, and had to kind of pivot to accommodate Mon-El. And Mon-El's a cool character, and he did some cool things with him. But losing Superman in Superman and in Action was kind of rough. But you did have a pretty solid 12-issue series, World of New Krypton, with Greg Rucka. That's probably my favorite stuff, because it dealt with Superman and how he was dealing with basically getting his culture back. But the entire thing is such a behemoth, and it does run the risk of being unwieldy, that I don't know if I would recommend it to someone who's not committed, let's say, to talking more readily about Superman. But maybe you'll feel differently when you do get around to it. I'll be fascinated to hear what you have to say.
All right, I appreciate the insight. I was hoping for an out, but your your insight is greatly appreciated. And for the audience, I'll do it. So we will get there. But in the meantime, we'll talk about these stories. Actually, one last preliminary question, something that I do like to ask first-time guests on the show. If you could tell me a little bit about your Superman fan journey. How did you get into the character in the first place? And I guess the other question that goes hand in hand with that I always like to ask, for myself, it's Smallville and Death of Superman. I consider those two of the major tent poles of my fandom. Like, what are the tent poles of your Superman fandom?
Oh gosh, it's a very loaded question. Let me tackle the first one first. I'll tackle them in order. The origins of my fandom, honestly, I don't really know. I don't remember a time in my life without Superman. My brother, who's 5 years older than me, was a big fan of checking into comics at the time, because this was the moment where, like in the early 90s, where you could get comics at gas stations and convenience stores, just grab them off the rack. And my dad would go to a regular gas station and pick a few comics off the rack and toss them in my brother's direction. And then when he was done with them, he'd toss them in my direction. So when I was born in late 87, so I was about 4.5, 5 years old when the Death of Superman really kicked in. And everything about that, it was just such an unusual time, because the mainstream culture was obsessed with comics, very briefly, but they were. And I was really caught up in that. I was really caught up in the sadness of losing this guy, because I was a kid. I didn't know that it was going to change, right? So that story, probably similarly to you, it just kind of set me on a path to pay closer attention to Superman. Lois and Clark started around that time, and Lois and Clark was a really influential show. I just remember being thrilled at the concept of watching live action Superman on a regular basis. And then it just kind of never left. In a lot of the other comics-based podcasting that I do, I honestly express that my favorite characters in fiction fluctuate between Batman and Superman. Those are just the characters that I gravitate to the most. I have had to defend Superman more. So I kind of feel like I'm a little more in the Superman camp a lot of the time, just because I feel like he deserves it and he needs it, which is kind of frustrating. But that really set me off on the path. And then I started working as a comic book retailer in 2007, right out of high school. And I would have that job for about 7 years. And just completely immersed myself, because no one else on the staff knew anything really about modern Superman. So I was the point person that took the bull by the horns and communicated to our customer base why you should be reading Superman. And I'm very proud to say that we upped our Superman orders significantly while I was there. But in terms of tent poles, that's a lot harder to answer. I mean, I think Superman the movie is probably like near the top of the list, just because I obsessively watched that movie as a kid. It was weird. I had a clamshell of Superman the movie, but I also had just a cardboard tape of Superman 4. So I didn't really understand the quality differential at the time. It was all Superman to me. And my dad and I, he was born in 1944, so he was like 10 years old when the George Reeves show was on, so that was really important to him. As soon as the original serials came out on VHS, we would spend one Saturday, or watch one episode every Saturday for like 13 or 14 weeks, however many episodes there was. I've got a lot of fond memories of that. So it's just, Superman has been a very, very important part of my life. And as I have gotten older, I've only grown to appreciate what he means more, as a symbol of hope, as a symbol of aspiration, and as a barometer to measure how we choose to live our lives based on the circumstances that we're given. What he says about being for everyone. That's one of the things that I love about like Jeff Johns' characterization, for instance. The confrontation between intolerance and tolerance, and being just a symbol that anybody can look to and feel inspired. That gets to the core of who Superman is and what he means to me, at least. I feel like I'm leaving a lot out, but for the for the purposes of time, without gushing overly much, I mean, Superman is just extraordinarily important to me and is the world's greatest hero in my estimation.
Well, beautifully said. I echo all of that. And I can see why Zach connected the two of us, because born in 87, death of Superman, worked at a comic shop. So we have a lot of similarities here. So I can really identify with, with what you're saying. And as far as, what you're saying about the nature of Superman and what he stands for, I think that's a perfect segue into the stories that we read. And I'll give a quick summary in a second, but, and I don't say this to pat myself on the back, but did these stories not pair perfectly together?
Oh, no, I think you nailed it when pairing these together. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's just like the two sides of the coin, and the grander importance that Superman has to like a stable society in the DC universe. There's a lot of commonality here in that respect.
Yeah, I had read, I'm trying to remember. I had read, I think, a little bit of Camelot Falls at the time. I don't think I ever read the entirety of it. And I do know that there were delays, and the 10 issues did not come out 10 months in a row. I think the first 5 came out, and then there was a break, and then 3, and then 1, and then it ultimately wrapped up in an annual. So I know that, I'm sure that didn't help the momentum or the readability of the story at the time. So I had read a little bit of that, but I don't think I had ever read the full thing. Black Ring, I think I had read the whole thing at some point, but it had been a long time. And as I was saying to you off mic, I did read the death issue of that storyline not too long ago when we covered Lex Luthor. We did our big Lex Luthor event. So that's what kind of put the story back on my radar. And I thought, it would be interesting now, armed with all of this Lex reading that I've done, to take another look at the story. But yeah, what you end up with when you look at these stories together, and for anyone who hasn't read either or both of them, and if you haven't read them together, I really do recommend it, because you get a very interesting meditation on the nature of Superman and Lex Luthor when you put these stories together. And I had the exact same thought as what you articulated. You really get two sides of the same coin. It's really fascinating. Like, I truly had a very enjoyable experience reading these two stories.
Yeah, I did too. I have revisited Black Ring more than I have Camelot Falls, but you're absolutely right. I mean, Superman books at the time that Camelot Falls were coming out, it seems, were prone to scheduling conflicts, because not only did Camelot Falls have a rather irregular schedule, but so did Last Son in Action with Jeff Johns and Adam Kubert. Very similar in that those titles were running consistently for a little bit, and then there was a hiccup in the schedule, and then it was several months, and Busiek actually pitch hit on a couple of intervening issues of Action there, and it ultimately ended up wrapping up in an annual as well. But Last Son seems like it's, at least among Superman fans, more commonly discussed than something like Camelot Falls. At the time I read it originally, I remember feeling like it was an extremely disjointed story. Having the benefit of being able to read all of the issues closely together, I don't have that criticism of it anymore. And I'm sure that we'll get into it, but no, it was a really pleasant experience reading this again. And Busiek, as he has done in so many other titles that he's written, I think your choice of the word meditation is extraordinarily apt, because he does spend time with not only the perceptions of other people when it comes to Superman, but his own perceptions of himself and what he wants to be and what he chooses to be every day. That's something that came through a lot more in my time reading it here.
Gotcha. No, that totally tracks with my reading of it as well. So, for anyone who is not familiar with Camelot Falls, again, this was a storyline in the Superman title by Kurt Busiek and Carlos Pacheco. And in it, the ancient Atlantean sorcerer Arion basically challenges Superman's existence and role in the world, and makes the argument that his presence is ultimately a hindrance to the advancement of human civilization. The idea is that civilizations are supposed to rise and fall. Camelot falls, right? Civilizations rise and fall, but when they come back stronger, and that's how we have growth and advancement. But by virtue of Superman and others in the superhero community always being there to sort of fight back the darkness, civilization doesn't have that opportunity to rise and fall and come back stronger. And on top of that, the darkness is pushed back, and the darkness then has the opportunity to get stronger, such that eventually it will come back and be so strong that no one will be able to withstand it. And so we have a couple of issues during the storyline where we get this look at the future of the DC universe if Superman doesn't step back. And we see that it's, this apocalyptic future and everyone dies out. So this really causes Superman to call it, to really reflect on what his role in the world should be. And I know, this is not the only story to deal with that. And I was reading reviews of Camelot Falls, and I'm summarizing, but that was a little bit of the spirit of some of the reviews that I was reading, was that this kind of wasn't necessarily breaking new ground, I suppose, but I really enjoyed the reflection that it prompted in Clark and the way it played out. And again, to what we were saying before, I really think reading the story in one chunk really helped kind of tie it all together.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, as I was reading it, because I was doing it digitally, I didn't want to hunt through my boxes because that's a whole thing. But as I was reading it this time, I couldn't help but think that, yeah, I can see how some people might label the aims of Camelot Falls as perhaps a bit derivative, especially if you're very familiar with Superman stories. But the creative team makes such a key difference here, because Busiek is very poetic in the way that he writes. And I feel like he is extraordinarily effective at cutting to the emotional quick of the way that certain characters are feeling and what is justifying them to act in stories. And he's also a huge comic book fan. So one of the things that I really appreciate about creators like Busiek, or a creator like Jeff Johns, for instance, is that they see continuity as a strength. There are these other characters that you can pull from, potentially from other eras of the publication timeline, to try and maybe give a new perspective on your title character. And by pulling in Arion from he made his first appearance in the early 80s, if I'm remembering correctly, you are getting a little bit of a different flavor, but you're also getting the Busiek writing, and you're getting the writing from someone who seems concerned with having Superman justify his own existence to himself and to the people who are most close to him. So I find that component of this story to be really engaging, but also there's Carlos Pacheco. My God. They have collaborated quite a few times. In fact, I think they're both collaborating together on an independent book at the moment that they both had to step away from because they both have some health problems, unfortunately. But the partnership between Busiek and Pacheco is clearly a powerful one. Like, they're very much in sync. And the pencils in this story are just phenomenal. They're so clean. The lines are so very strong. And it's just like definitive Superman in terms of like poster-worthy images and a lot of the splash pages. The coloring, I think it shifts to Alex Sinclair in some of the later ones. And I like his coloring with Pacheco's pencils a little bit less. I can't remember the original colorist who I like more for some reason at the moment. But the vibrancy, I think, can be an important thing to have when you draw Superman. And they really lean into that. But then you also have characters like the prankster coming in randomly. And of course he would be random when he comes in. There's just a lot of stuff to like here. And it's a story that feels like it is steeped not only in recent developments in the DC universe for the time, but it also feels extended from Superman's lineage. And I think that's part of what I enjoy the most about this story.
Yes. And to that last point, I read this largely in a vacuum now. And yes, while I could see certain threads from what was going on at the time, and, about halfway through Camelot Falls, Chris Kent shows up, right, from the Last Son storyline that Johns and Donner were doing. So you definitely, have those ties to what was going on in the other books, but it read great on its own. So I think there's a timelessness to it as well, which I hope that people, I don't know, discover it or rediscover it. I don't know how often it's necessarily talked about. Although, as far as the art, I see that cover, and I forget which issue number it is, but the one of Superman sitting in space with his hand in his chin as he's pondering. You see that thinker. A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's beautiful. So Pacheco is a guy that I have taken a particular interest in, mostly in his mainstream comics work. I haven't really read a lot of his independents, but he also collaborated with Rick Remender in, I think it was 2013, on Captain America. And his pencils for Cap are equally as impeccable. He just has such like, even a story like that, Captain America was in a bit of a different costume during that time, so it wasn't like the classic look necessarily, but it still looked and felt classic because he has such care and attention in the pencils. That's just my perception anyway. And seeing him really bring his full skill to bear on a character like Superman, for some reason, I think it was in the very first issue, and I remember feeling this way at the time that issue came out. There's just a shot of Superman flying in, it's like very high up in the air, and he's flying into a panel from the side. And I don't know why it sticks with me even now, but it's just, you see Superman's boots and his cape fluttering from the flying, and there's something about that quality that just felt really like realistic to me. Like, what does it look like if someone is flying into the earth, you know? And I think it's just the sense of dimension that Pacheco adds to it. You know, he brings a weird sense of realism to the fantasy in those instances. And it's panels like that, rather innocuous panels or at least by most measures, but it's stuff like that that just really dials me into the escapist component and really lets me live in that world ever so briefly. And you know, he's a creator that I can't say enough about. I think that he's just excellent.
I'm sure you have read it, given what a fan you are, but JLA, JSA, Virtue and Vice.
Oh, yes, of course.
That's one that, for all of the various prunings of my collection that I've done over the years, that's one that always stays. It's the JLA, JSA, Virtue and Vice. Pacheco drew it, written by Jeff Johns and David Goyer. This was during the time of their JSA series. And it's not in print as far as I know. I think it might be included in one of those JSA omnibus editions.
Omnibus volumes, yeah, I think so.
But it's great, and the art is gorgeous. But that's a story that is a favorite of mine as well. Yeah, I love his stuff, and I think it really suits Superman perfectly. I think, you know, in reading this storyline, and to that criticism about, you know, some of the questions being derivative of stories that we've read before, I think that the way it was presented felt more nuanced than maybe other instances. You know, kind of what I laid out before, this idea of civilizations, and it just felt like it was fleshed out a little bit more. It wasn't just, hey, you're here, you're holding people back. It felt like it kind of got at some larger ideas about history and society, and it gave a little more weight to this argument. And I also, the thing that really, I think, just put it over the top for me was what allows Superman to finally come to a resolution about this. He's out in space, he's pondering, he's, you know, a little bit of a crossroads, but he comes back to Earth, right? And there's that little girl who's playing on the balcony, and she starts to fall, and he catches her. And very shortly thereafter, he has the confrontation with Arion, and he talks about how, yeah, maybe my presence here is having this effect. Maybe we will get to this future that you've shown me, but when someone's in trouble, I can't not help them. And I think, you know, going back to what you were saying before about what Superman represents and what he means to us, I think what really resonated about that with me was that I think that's kind of how I try to go about my day-to-day, is trying to be a person of action and trying to focus on the small, controllable things. That's something that has been very important to me, because it's great that these days, you know, there's a lot more talk about mental health and all of that, and that's great. And I see people post, and I see how easy it can be to get stuck. And the thing that I guess I've always tried to keep in mind, and that I think has served me well, is just, again, focusing on just those small controllable things. And you build from there, like one step. I'm a big Rocky fan, so one step at a time, one punch at a time, one round at a time. And that's like a personal philosophy. And so kind of seeing a version of that in the story and seeing how that kind of unlocked this problem for him. It's like, regardless of what the bigger picture might be that I can't control, I can control in this instance when someone needs help. I'm not going to turn my back on them. And that's enough of an answer for me. I really liked that piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like focus is a recurring theme across this story. The moment that you bring up, I mean, one of the things that I like to do, particularly for my show, The Comic Binge, when I read something digitally, is that I always take screenshots for pages or panels that stick out to me, because then it just helps me to refer back to them later. And that whole page where he's talking about saving Esperanza Luisa Sanchez, it speaks to the core. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and I'm sure that you've gotten in this conversation just as much, if not potentially more than I have, about, well, what do you see in Superman? Like he's such a boring character. And it's like, no, the thing that you just mentioned about controlling what you can is pivotal to understanding what makes him tick. And the thing with Superman is that he's so capable that he can just do a lot more than anyone else can. So he takes on a higher degree of responsibility. And I think it's one of the things that we probably agree on a lot when it comes to Superman, is just like the backward extrapolation of how you apply those lessons in your own life. It's really important to be able to focus on what you can control, especially now. There's so many competing components for anybody's attention at any given time. The world is basically a cacophony, and focusing on what you can do right in front of you is really pivotal for just managing your own mental health. And with Superman, he's able to do a lot more, but he also has to face a lot of those similar problems, because the world for him is quite literally a cacophony, right? I mean, he can see everything, he can hear everything. And it's just over the course of his life that he's been able to hone himself so that he has the ability to focus through all of the noise. But seeing how he is able to articulate to someone who does not understand his philosophy about how he gets through every day, and how just the desire to help is what gets him from point A to point B. It was a deeply emotional reading experience for me this time. I can't remember how I felt the first time I read it, but I'd be surprised if I felt very differently about it. But no, I loved that page, and it just does speak to the strength of Superman as a character, as a concept, and as Kurt Busiek sees him in this story. You brought up the criticisms too. I mean, if I were to think about how this struck people at the time, I guess there is a chance, and I haven't gone back to read like contemporary reviews of the time, but Busiek might in certain respects get a little long-winded at times. It doesn't bother me. Like, I mean, if I can read a Kevin Smith comic with a word balloon that takes up half the page, I'm probably not going to be all that worried about what Kurt Busiek is doing. But sometimes he does take a little bit to get going, but he makes every word count. I guess that's what I appreciate about it.
Yes. So a couple of things. Number one, I know people are very split on the Snyder movies. They always seem to come up in conversation, but one of my favorite moments in Man of Steel is when he's a kid and he's struggling to figure out how to use his powers, and he's overwhelmed. And, Martha comes and gives him the advice of, he says, the world's too big. She's like, make it small. Just this idea of like really focusing in, again, just, seeing those connection points. But I think that, again, as far as this idea of some of these criticisms, I can overlook a lot, because Busiek imbues the character with so much humanity. And that was one of the other big things that I was really struck by reading this. I love, love, love his take on Clark and Superman. He feels more real here to me than in a lot of other stories, and it's little things. And even going back to that Up, Up, and Away storyline that came before this, now that was co-written by Johns and Busiek, but I would put money on this moment being from Busiek. And it's a teeny tiny thing, but this is, the period where Clark's been powerless for the whole, 1 year later duration. And, there's a moment where he talks about like, oh, I got to stop by the video store and pick up the latest box set. I missed so much TV being Superman. Just, again, a tiny little thing, but it's like, yeah, I could see that. And in this one, there's that moment where he's on the plane and he's, reading a novel, right? Yeah. And he's like, oh, there's a central conceit that the author doesn't really sell, but, like little tiny things like that. It just, or even when, he and Lois are talking about, that woman, Callie, who he had, potentially a romantic past with. And, they're kind of discussing that. Just these little moments where he just feels like a person, a fleshed out person. I love that so much. And so, I can get past, some long-windedness or anything like that because I can buy into this take on the character and I'm along for the ride. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up because I started reading this because the collected edition, I went back and referenced the collected editions to make sure that I was reading the right issues at the time. And first collected edition starts at 654, which is like literally a month after Up, Up, and Away ends. And that issue in particular, in terms of the humanity, I think is critical because not only is he just like struggling against the weight of time to be able to celebrate this anniversary that they don't reveal what it is until the end of the story, but he also has to juggle all of his other responsibilities in addition to being Superman. And I love the controlled chaos of that issue because like he's doing what he can to listen to a boring city council meeting and he's taking notes in his head while he's being held underwater by a supervillain. And he's I wish I could get an interview with this police staffer, but I'll just have to push forward and do what I can later. And he doesn't end up finishing all the stories that he needs to, but then you have his wife come in. And I didn't realize it at the time that the New 52 started, but after I read Superman #1 from the New 52, and I knew well in advance that they had dissolved the marriage. But reading that first issue gave me an incredible sense of loss for this relationship. And that's groundwork that Busiek might be responsible for because the marriage is it's depicted so well in this story in particular, and really across Busiek's entire run. And, Busiek helped to, or I think he basically did write a weekly series with the 3 primary characters in DC. And I'll mention that part in a minute because I think that there is another good human Clark moment in there. But the way that the marriage between Clark and Lois is written as just such an equal partnership between the two of them that still has this undercurrent of love and understanding for each other's circumstances is something that I so appreciate. Because that did contribute again to a sense of loss in the New 52. It's like, did we really have to leave that behind? And thankfully, several years later, they decided to course correct a bit. But I just love the way that their relationship is written here, and I think that adds to the human component that you describe, because it is a recognizable relationship in marriage, and I appreciate that immensely.
I agree completely. Let's take a quick commercial break and then we'll continue along this track. We'll be right back. This episode made possible by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is moving to the South Jersey area and looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They are also looking for their new local comic shop, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZLComics. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw yeah. And we're back. Yeah, I am totally with you on everything that you laid out with respect to that issue and the relationship between Lois and Clark that we get in the story. I think if I had to give someone one issue from Camelot Falls, it would probably be that one.
Sure.
Because I love exactly what you laid out. I mean, him just trying to balance these two sides and ultimately not being able to, but having his wife, pick up the slack and help him out. That it was such a, that really struck me as well. And I think that's something that, if I guess I did read that issue back in the day before I was in a relationship, before I was married. I don't know that would have resonated with me as much as it does now as a husband. And it's like, yeah, like sometimes
Sure.
you need your partner's help like that. And especially in the case of Superman, he's there for everyone, but like, who's there for him? And there she is. Now, I will say real quick on the note of the New 52, I did an episode a little while ago. I made peace with the New 52. I came around on a lot of it, but at the time, I was really not a fan. And even looking back, I can appreciate it as a moment in time where they're not together. But yeah, my default, my preference is always to have that relationship. And I think this is a perfect story that encapsulates why and what that offers. And there are other moments too, certainly the Lois and Clark of it all is very powerful, but there's a little Jimmy moment that, it really got me when Perry, Clark, Lois, and Jimmy, right, they're having lunch and they're talking about this question because they've seen this future laid out by Ariane about this apocalyptic destiny that awaits them. And they're debating what Superman's role should be. And Perry's, he's a little coming down a little hard on Superman, but not Jimmy. And later on, as Clark is reflecting on this, he's like, yeah, Jimmy didn't think that. Not Jimmy. Never Jimmy. That's what he says. Never Jimmy. Like Jimmy never doubt, never, kind of doubt him in that way. It was a great moment. I really love that.
Lives up to the title of Superman's pal.
That's his buddy.
In every sense of the word. No, I totally agree with you. And I also appreciate too, though, that Superman has the patience and the wherewithal to approach any topic as objectively as possible, even if the topic is himself, because he's confronted with this idea that maybe I am contributing to some of this. And it comes from Perry White. I mean, if you had to try and list the, granted, Superman is a guy who respects a lot of people, but Perry White is probably near the top of the list, like maybe right below his parents, as far as we know. So I appreciated that Busiek used Perry to introduce the idea that maybe what Ariane was saying had a degree of merit to it. Because naturally, his reporter's instinct, Superman's reporter's instinct, is going to run down the facts of a situation. And, he's going to balance that with his own perspective, because how could you not? When the subject is you, I mean, you have to balance your own thoughts along with objectivity. And it's one of the things that I think tends to get lost when people talk generally about Superman, is that, his position as a reporter is one that forces him to think objectively about the world around him. And when the situation calls for it, to think about himself as objectively as possible. So I appreciated that issue, both for seeing Superman's pal in full action, but also for what Perry and Lois were adding to that conversation too. I feel like more of that conversation in terms of DC Comics is reserved for Batman, but it really doesn't need to be, because Superman can potentially have a conversation related to that topic on a much larger scale than Batman can. So leaning into that for dramatic purposes, I think, is a great move to take for a story.
Yes. I mean, I think there's a maturity to this story in terms of the story itself, but also Clark's approach to it, right? And trying to come to terms with what's been presented to him. And yeah, I think that scene with the Daily Planet staff is a great example. And even in terms of him seeking out Zatanna's help as well, right? To try to get a little bit more background or context. He'll also later have a conversation with the Phantom Stranger, right? About like, is this actually going to happen? Is it the future? Is it a future? But just the way that he went about it, I think we could have gotten an easier, less nuanced version of this story where it's just kind of like this thing that we're building toward and he's resisting it. I think the way that Busiek structured it really did allow for that reflection, for that meditation on the character. And I think that's why the story works, to the extent that it does. I'll also say my audience might be surprised that I enjoyed a story this much that has to deal with magic and the supernatural. I've said many times, those are typically not the Superman stories I gravitate toward, just the personal preference. But here it worked, which I think that's probably the biggest and best compliment I can pay this story, is that for someone who doesn't really like the Superman stories dealing with magic, sorcery, the supernatural, I really still liked this. So I think that says a lot about what was going on there.
Well, also too, I mean, Superman himself agreed with you in this story when he was talking to Zatanna, right? He's like, magic's not my thing. Can you just fill me in, please? Because it's not something that I pay attention to all that much. Which I was kind of surprised to see that he said that, just because, he's got two very well documented weaknesses, right? And one of them is very broad, and it's magic. But no, I agree with you. I mean, in general, sword and sorcery really isn't my thing all that much. I'm much more likely to gravitate toward a Superman story I've seen or read 1,000 times versus, I don't know, Game of Thrones. I was never really into those things very much. And Game of Thrones just decided it built up heroes and then just killed them all. And I tend to prefer stories with strong heroes in them. What a shock. But but no, I mean, the mature tone, I think you're absolutely right about, because Busiek approaches the material in a learned way. He's clearly a guy who has a deep understanding of the mythology of the character and of the medium, frankly. But he's also someone who is well read in the medium enough that pulling in a character like Ariane, or even jumping back into history to serve as the basis for Kyber, and melding like magic and mythology together to create this rather potent and unique threat. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that a lot of these characters really haven't appeared at all since this moment. And specifically, like Ariane, I think has appeared through this point and then up through like Rebirth and even recently. But Kyber, we haven't seen since this point. And Subject 17, we haven't seen since this point either. So this is a pretty unique story. And like you said, it's probably not on a lot of people's radars, and they can probably grab a lot on eBay of all of these issues for reasonably cheap if they wanted to. So it's certainly worthy of revisiting just because of the acumen on display in the writing, and as we discussed already too, the artwork.
Well, again, as far as it not being on people's radar, I'll be honest. Initially I wasn't sure if I would do this episode because, in terms of what I put out, I try not to deal with such deep cuts. Not that this is even a deep cut per se, but, stuff that people are more aware of or have access to or have read or watched. And ultimately I said, I just think this is worthy of it. It's a strong story, and maybe this will turn a few people onto it or maybe prompt a reread, if they haven't been to it in a while. So I'm glad that we're doing this. And you mentioned Subject 17. So I know we've been talking about these larger ideas about Superman's role in the world, but as far as some of the more nuts and bolts of the story, the Subject 17 piece of it, to me, was really fascinating, right? So we're in Kazakhstan, and Clark is requested by this scientist of the unexplained, essentially, Callie, who we find out he had, a past with while he was traveling the world after he left Smallville. And so Subject 17 is just really, a flip on the Superman origin story, right? This alien who came to Earth and was born as his parents were dying, but rather than being taken in by a kindly couple, is subjected to, horrendous, countless experiments and torture over years. And ultimately breaks out, and, Superman has to fight him. And that's ultimately then when Ariane intervenes, but Subject 17 comes back later. And yeah, I really enjoyed that piece of it. Again, confronting Superman with, that mirror image of what could have been. And I think what kind of took that piece of the story to the next level for me was when Subject 17 came back. And after he had spent time in the world and he had learned the language and, basically offers Superman this deal, right? Like, if you don't save these people, I'll stand down. And it's like, and, Superman's response is like, well, that's a position I can't be in. Like, I could never accept that. Again, sort of going back to these like fundamentals of who the character is. What was your take on all the Subject 17 of it all?
I found the poetry appropriate considering his origin sort of intersecting with the fundamentals of Superman's origin as we understand him. And also, too, honestly, I was reminded of we go from Subject 17 to Subject 1. It seems like a lot of the groundwork that is laid in terms of the particulars of Subject 17 were kind of applied to Kal-El himself by the time Flashpoint rolled around. So, the just putting that together after the fact, I found to be pretty interesting, but it also, I think, illustrates that there is quite a degree of merit here. In this story, having Superman, or giving Superman, I should say, the opportunity to examine what his life would be, because we see this happen in Elseworlds or in Flashpoint, for instance, but Superman himself can't really review those circumstances because he's involved in them. He's not an objective observer, but with Subject 17, he is. So even if that's a note that might ring familiar for Superman fans, the unique component is giving Superman himself the opportunity to react and respond to it. And I love how even in the middle of that fight, as Callie is basically talking through the origin of Subject 17 while Superman is embroiled in battle with him, it's just compassion that washes over him. He needs to handle the situation, and he probably needs to do it in a definitively and decisively physical way. But at the end of the day, Subject 17 is a victim. And even if his perspective has been perverted and Superman has to stop him because Subject 17 is so determined to cause mass destruction and death, the tragedy of his origin story is something that I appreciated that Busiek put at the front of Superman's mind while he was dealing with him, up through to the last moment they interact with each other. So I just thought, like, I can see how some people might see it as a detour from the main story. It kind of is, but sometimes detours take you to some interesting places. And I thought that it was more than fair game in the context of everything else that he was dealing with.
Yeah, and especially since in this story we're building towards a look at a potential future. I think, right, a conflict that causes him to reflect on his beginnings is perfectly appropriate. So yeah, I was definitely on board with that. And we mentioned Callie. We also have another ex. Well, not that Callie was necessarily an ex, but Lana Lang. This story positions her as the new CEO of LexCorp. So this is after the whole ruin business from the Greg Rucka Adventures of Superman run. And she and Pete have gotten divorced, and she's now taking over LexCorp. It's funny. In talking about Superman and Lois at the beginning of this year on the podcast, I talked about how I feel like that show has given us the best treatment of Lana Lang. And I still ultimately stand by that, but there have been other instances when I did my New 52 episode, and now here. I think these stories do go a good bit of the way towards making up for, I think, some of the weaker, characterization of Lana, during the Triangle era. As much as I love that period, but I don't think it did the character a ton of favors.
No, I'm totally inclined to agree with you. I mean, when it comes to the New 52 stuff, the use of Lana was far better than I expected it to be. And I also appreciated how she ended up being a really important conduit to the stuff that they would do with Superman and Rebirth. I actually just located the Tomasi Gleason omnibus. Like, I'd been looking for it. I guess it had fallen out of print, but I was determined and I found it, and I brought it home, and I've been revisiting those stories. And yeah, at the very beginning, Lana's an important player, and she's also an important player in like Final Days of Superman that leads up to it. But their relationship is built on a mutual respect that you don't often see. And I think the lens of the New 52 allowed them to take it in that kind of a direction. However, what you see from Lana here, where all of that history is intact regarding their romantic entanglements and their history together growing up in Smallville, I think the thing that sticks out to me the most about Lana, who when she's used well during this era of DC in particular, is that there's a little bit of a mournful quality to her, where Clark is the one that got away. I mean, it's kind of like a more serious version of Lana's characterization in Superman 3, which is it's a totally fair game as far as I'm concerned. Having her ascend to a senior position in LexCorp for the dramatic purposes that are at play here, it does add an interesting wrinkle to everything, especially like if you were reading the books around this time and you saw that she was the second lady of the United States for a while there. There is a lot of history that's wrapped up into it, but Busiek, I appreciate how he acknowledges it and then he moves on to what he needs to do in his story. He doesn't let previous continuity bog down what he's trying to do when it comes to his narrative goals and aims. But she's an important player here, and I like the idea, at least at during this point in time, that LexCorp has the potential to be used in Superman's corner as opposed to being pointed at him by its typical founder and CEO, right? But their first interaction where they talk and Lana explains that she's dropped the Ross from her name, and how it's starting to become clear that this could be maybe potentially a force for good in Metropolis. There was a lot of good potential there, but there is something about that relationship that has a bit of a mournful, or I guess maybe melancholy quality that is played very straight and appropriately. And it just, for me anyway, in the reading experience for Camelot Falls, it provides a great contrast to the relationship that he has now with his wife, so it's a deft use of Lana here, and she's not a main focus, nor should she be, but using her as a way to put LexCorp on the board for the events of the story, I thought was really cool.
Yes, I think it worked. It worked very well. We still, of course, have to get to the Black Ring. One other thing, though, that I wanted to single out about Camelot Falls, The chapter where Arion puts Superman under a spell and the government K Squad comes in, right? This
Right.
branch of the military that's been trained and armed to intervene. It costs $1 million a second, they say, every time they're out in the field. But anytime that it seems like Superman has been compromised, brainwashing, spell, clone, whatever it might be, they're deployed. So they come in. What I love about this issue is that the way it builds and the way it really helps you feel the frustration that Superman is experiencing, right? Because he is able to overcome this spell relatively quickly because of the training that he's undergone. He talks about, Martian Manhunter gave him exercises to do if he's ever in a situation like that. So he's kind of getting past it on his own when the K Squad intervenes. Prankster, who you mentioned before, has to get his licks in there, giant, electrified pie in his face. Then, as Superman is trying to go after the bad guy, the JLA and JSA show up, right? To be like, we can help both of them. And there's this moment where Clark just really lets it out. He's like, I'm fine. And you feel the frustration there. That was one of my favorite issues. And it led to a great moment in one of the later issues, I believe, where again, as he's doing all this reflecting on his place in the world, and I think this is in one of the final chapters where he's thinking to himself, the eyes of a planet. This is when, towards the end of the story, Lana is using those special cameras that LexCorp has developed to track Superman in this battle in order to show the marketability of or the viability of these cameras. Because again, LexCorp, very dire financial straits at the moment. But Clark
grasping at anything that'll work in the market. Yeah,
exactly. So, but Clark thinks to himself, the eyes of a planet watching their alien champion who they count on when they're not scared of him. And I love that moment because it's like, yeah, it's as, Clark's wrestling with all of this within himself, but he's also dealing with what the people think of him and being faced with the reality of, there's this whole squad that's been designed without my knowing, right? For instances like this. I don't know. It just pulls a lot into focus, but I love that issue for the way it really, it really made you empathize with the character. I felt his frustration in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a weird kind of amplification of what he went through in the first issue, where he's just trying to stay on top of things. But this time he's having to ward off mental manipulation and all of these just cascading physical problems that he's got to just work his way through, even among his friends. This one in particular did stick out to me too, just because I have revisited Sacrifice very recently. So, the manipulation at the hands of Maxwell Lord, that's a heart-stopping moment in the lead up to Infinite Crisis. And of course, it culminates in Wonder Woman potentially taking things probably a step too far. Although, it's a little obfuscated as stories pre-Infinite Crisis were wont to do. But this instance and his ability to ward off the manipulation from Arion was in direct response to what Maxwell Lord did to him. So again, it's a good use of the continuity, of the recent continuity, while also giving service to a lot of these other character moments that we've seen over the course of the entire story. I love the moment that you mentioned where the lettering just makes it clear that it's like an ear-splitting "I'm fine." Like he's really pushing it forward through those Kryptonian lungs to make sure that everybody can hear him. Not too much though. He doesn't want to split their eardrums, but they definitely are going to hear him. And I liked that Hal Jordan was kind of the point person there, because even if it wasn't directly mentioned, I feel like Hal has a unique insight into being misunderstood. So it seemed like it was appropriate for him to consume the information from Superman and be like, oh, okay, all right, you're fine. That's good. I trust you. It's just one of the other strengths of reading, superhero comics on an ongoing scale. You get these things. And I feel like Busiek might have done that on purpose. I don't know for sure, of course, but it felt right in the moment. But that frustration, it was like a whole other side of the spectrum, considering all of the shenanigans, let's say, that he had to deal with back in issue 654. I love that moment too.
And as far as the Hal of it all, it cuts both ways. I agree. It makes, on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense for him to be the one because he's been through this experience. But on the other hand, I feel like, though it's not stated, but I feel like that also feeds into Clark's frustration because you have to imagine there's like a tiny part of him that looks at Hal at the forefront and it's like, really? You of all people?
Don't you get it? Come on, man. Yeah.
And the other thing about that issue that again, like just really, really ties into the humanity and the relatability of the character. At the end of the story, Clark tracks down Prankster, right? And he talks about how like, I just needed a win. Now look, he would want to bring Prankster to justice anyway, but really in this context, it's like all of these debacles over the course of that afternoon. And it's like, he needed a win. So I really, that issue was another highlight for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. No, I really appreciated everything that was at play here, and it really just it serves as a bit of a microcosm in terms of the strength of the characterizations that Busiek brings to bear over the course of his writing. And of course, the layouts are impeccable. The action is so clearly defined and rendered in this story, and it's a pretty important part of a comic book reading experience, of course. But yeah, like you mentioned before, this is likely these days an easy one to overlook. That would be a mistake. I mean, Kurt Busiek is a creator with a well-deserved impeccable reputation, and him spending pretty sizable chunk of his time on Superman, it's just another feather in the character's cap. So it's certainly worthy of revisiting if someone has not. Revisiting if you've read it before, or coming to for the first time if you've never read it before.
I co-sign on that. I mean, here's the thing. I know everyone always goes to Superman's Secret Identity, and deservedly so. It's a beautiful story. It's a favorite of mine. I'm long overdue for a revisitation of that. We'll get there eventually. But if you enjoyed that and you're looking for, for more from Kurt Busiek, I would certainly recommend Camelot Falls. So as we hit the hour mark here, let us turn our attention to the Black Ring. And actually a good segue, I suppose, talking about Hal Jordan, Green Lantern, because this spins right out of the Blackest Night event, which I read, but I don't really have the strongest or most positive memories of. I mean, my experience with the Jeff Johns Green Lantern era, I loved the beginning of it. I loved Rebirth. I loved the way he brought Hal back. I really enjoyed the Secret Origin arc. I liked a lot of Sinestro Corps War, and kind of lost me when we got into, and this is really its own conversation, but as much as I love the idea of the entire spectrum and the different rings and the different core and all of that, it got a little bit much for me at a certain point, and probably around the time of Blackest Night, I kind of was checking out a little bit. But in any event, that's sort of our jumping off point here, right? Lex has tasted the power of the Orange Lantern ring and has been part of this Blackest Night event, and now is seeking out the power of the Black Ring, right? And he's identified these spheres across the Earth and in outer space, and he and his team, including a robotic android Lois Lane, which is fascinating, are scouring the globe to track these down, and are using a device that changes the nature of the power. And once he's completed this task with all of the spheres, in theory, this will unlock the power of the Black Lantern ring, or just the Black Lantern. So what was your take on this? And I guess, how did it hold up from prior readings?
Well, I mean, I was so dialed in to Blackest Night as it was coming out. I mean, I only went to San Diego Comic-Con 2 years. It was 2008 and 2009. So I went for the summer of Final Crisis, and I went for the summer of Blackest Night. So it was impossible for me to escape the hype. I was also a retailer at this time. So, by necessity, I had to keep up with all of the stories as they were coming out, but it wasn't much of a necessity. I was very much bought into what Johns was doing on Green Lantern. And, it wasn't just because of Green Lantern. I think the thing that I liked about Jeff Johns driving the ship at DC for as long as he did is that he had the license to weave in through a bunch of different characters all at once. So what he was doing by the time like Sinestro Corps War rolled around, for instance, really did come out of what he did in Infinite Crisis. Superboy Prime was a really important character in both series, and Johns would use Prime for years afterward, up through what, like a year ago or 2 years ago, thereabouts. So I thought that that was just a really well-defined villain. But Blackest Night in particular, I just remember feeling like it was relentless, like it was weirdly, like, for a story about the emotional spectrum, I remember feeling drained, especially in the first like half, especially with some of the tie-ins. Like they did, Johns did an Adam Hawkman one shot with Ryan Sook that kind of spilled out of a really, really gruesome and sad moment out of the first issue of the main series. It was a little bit easier to not be as dialed in because for a big DC event, Superman wasn't really that involved in it. And Bruce Wayne, for at least as far as most people knew, was dead. So this was a unique moment in terms of like a DC Comics event series where the two marquee characters were kind of off the board. In another sense, that makes it unique and kind of interesting to see how the story plays out. But all things considered, I appreciate Blackest Night a lot now. It's not in terms of like the trilogy of Johns's events with Green Lantern, it's probably the one I've revisited the least compared to Rebirth and Sinestro Corps War. But I probably like it a little bit more than you do. But I don't know. Maybe we'll have to unpack that one at some point in the future.
I will say, I mean, I'm not, especially after reading Black Ring, I'm not totally unopposed to revisiting it. And what's crazy, I was thinking about how long it's been. I remember specifically, this was my post-law school, post-bar exam reading project. So it was summer of 2012, which, in retrospect, it's like, I don't know if that was the right reading project for that time, especially when we got to the Blackest Night portion of it. I don't know. So that might have colored my perspective on all of it. So I would potentially be open to giving that another shot.
Yeah, I mean, it might be something that we end up doing on the Comic Binge. If we do, I'll let you know.
Right on.
Yeah, but either way, I mean, I think one of the things that Johns excels at is, in a weird way, his casting, for lack of a better term. You have these emotional spectrum core. So if you are going to put recognizable DC characters to occupy those spaces, then who do you choose? When it comes to greed, it's hard to find a better subject than Lex Luthor. And with fear, it was hard to find a better subject than Jonathan Crane. It was like I was dialed into what he was doing with the quote unquote new Guardians. I thought that was an interesting idea. I was surprised that I will say I felt like Superman got snubbed on the Hope side for Barry Allen, but that's fine. I like Barry Allen. It's cool. And he was recently returned at that point. So maybe he could have used the limelight a little bit more. But what Blackest Night set up with Lex Luthor and what the core desire of his has always been, that's fertile territory for a longer term story. And I don't think that at the time the Black Ring started, it was totally clear that we were in for a universal shakeup on the scale of the New 52. But in hindsight, I actually find it really fascinating that really the last major story of pre-boot Action Comics was like a full year where Lex Luthor was the star of the book. Like, just on concept, that's really interesting to me. And I think it's kind of a unique occurrence in terms of certainly superhero comics. But this was a lot of fun.
Yes, I really enjoyed this one as well. I can't say I've read a ton else by Paul Cornell, to be honest. But I really loved his work here, and the Pete Woods art was absolutely gorgeous. Those just clean lines. It told a story beautifully. I just want to jump back to Barry Allen for a quick second. Not to dump on Barry Allen, but I remember reading the solicitations for Flash Rebirth #1, the first Flash Rebirth. And it was like, all heroes in the DC universe quake in the footsteps of Barry Allen or something to that effect. And I just remember thinking like, all right, like let's calm down a little bit. But it was his moment. It was his moment. I understand. But yeah, when we're talking about hope, like yourself, I would gravitate more towards Superman. Anyway, yeah, I had a similar thought. Actually, both similar thoughts, that I love that Lex got the spotlight and that he had it for as long as he did. I wish we saw more like that. I mean, it's tough on the Superman front these days. He doesn't have a ton of titles. It's not like Batman. It's, talk about solicitations. You're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It's still Batman section. So not as much real estate. But yeah, I love that Lex had that opportunity. And I was thinking about that too. It's like, after this story, you have Reign of the Doomsdays, and that's it. And then we're into New 52 territory. So yeah, there's something really interesting and cool and oddly fitting that Lex was like the last big, spotlight before it all went away.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird to think about now, but DC was actually prone to doing this at the time, where they took their longest running titles and they gave them to characters that have not occupied them all that much, or in the case of like Batwoman and Detective Comics, had never occupied them before. But I like that they took that swing, because the concept of those stories, generally speaking, is very strong. I mean, when you have Greg Rucka writing Detective Comics, it's not irrelevant that Batman isn't there, but it's less of a factor if he's still going to be playing in Gotham City for all intents and purposes. It's a Greg Rucka Gotham City story. Yeah, let's see what that's like, especially if Bruce Wayne isn't around. But in this instance, Lex Luthor as a character doesn't really get anything resembling an ongoing series at all. And not that, his time in Action Comics was going to be permanent, far from it. And I think everybody knew that going into it. Just Superman was occupied. So let's do something interesting with Action. And it did help to keep Action Comics in the upper tier of DC titles while this was coming out, because Lex Luthor is a fascinating guy. I think that for my money, he's one of the single most fascinating villains that DC has access to, bar none. And it's because of how complicated he is and how extremely well-informed his self-interest is. And that comes through so well over the course of this story. And then the way that, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but it was a nice way to celebrate 900 issues of Action when we did get to that point, and to make a natural transition back, even though it would just be a few months later before we were on to a new number one. But still, I appreciate and actually love the trajectory of this story. And, it's not deviating from the norm in an ongoing comic book series, especially the most time-honored comic book series in existence, is a pretty unique occurrence, but it feels justified here.
Absolutely. And, it's, again, thinking about how these stories, parallel each other, just like we were talking about with respect to Camelot Falls here too. I really enjoyed Black Ring, despite not loving Blackest Night and not having reread it before this. And also knowing that all of this was going to change anyway shortly thereafter with the New 52, like it holds up in and of itself. And that's a testament to the story, because not everything does. So the fact that you could kind of go to this now so many years later, knowing what was to come and knowing what it came out of, and it still works unto itself is very cool. I love that Lex had the spotlight. I love that we get this tour through the DC universe, right? The Arkham issue with Joker and all the Vandal Savage stuff. It's again, I guess in a similar way to Camelot Falls, where yes, there is obviously an ongoing narrative and we're building towards something, but you do also get these vignettes as well, and you get some great insight into this character and what makes him tick.
Yeah, and what gets him out of bed in the morning? I mean, what a surprise! It's the promise of acquiring more power, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what he wants. But it also takes. It's kind of weird reading this next to Camelot Falls, because we go from Luthor being firmly established in the public's mind as a career criminal, and then this story starts and he's got control of his company again. There's a certain symmetry or poetry to that as well, I think, in certain respects. But either way, it's interesting to see, because he's kind of he's kind of on a tear once he's back into power, at least to a sense of power that he's familiar with, but he has had a taste of something more. And the tools that he uses to try and acquire this power at a higher degree. I mean, how did you feel when you saw, or at least when it became clear that he had built a facsimile of Lois to basically serve as his right hand? Because to me, it felt like a violation in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that thought definitely crossed my mind. I mean, there's, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, what role is she serving when he's out on his quest, and in terms of questioning him, challenging him, offering another perspective? There's that piece of it, but then, there's also the other side of what's going on behind closed doors. And yes, I agree. I mean, there's definitely that piece of it that is very gross and twisted, but also didn't feel, felt on brand for Lex.
Yeah, well, he's also had, especially in the modern age, like since Burn, this fixation on Lois. And it's not always necessarily romantic. I think there's just something about the fact that he understands that she is close to his enemy that makes him feel overridingly acquisitive. I don't really know how else to put it, but there's something about this that feels like it's designed to dig at Superman, even though Superman, for all intents and purposes, as far as we know, has no idea that this is taking place. But I think it adds to his pettiness, and I think it brings something to bear about the kind of person that he is. That, Superman, we saw in the story that we read previously that he will struggle, and it's nice to get a win once in a while. It's always good to be able to go home and feel like you've got a sense of satisfaction. But Luthor feels that all the time. He never stops competing, especially when it comes to Superman. I mean, Camelot Falls also did a nice job of illustrating what Luthor's potential could be if he could just get his obsession out of the way. But Luthor also, over the course of this, feels a little frustrated because the focus of his ire is not in front of him, and he can't really devote himself at the moment to getting Superman off the board until the end of the story, which goes the way that it goes. But I just really liked what this entire arc contributes to the overall tapestry of Lex Luthor as a character, because you're right, the complexity of his repugnance, I guess, knows no bounds. And I like that Paul Cornell chose to illustrate that in a variety of different ways, up through and including even his youth, as we see.
Oh yeah, that's right. In that Action Annual, where you get a glimpse into his early days in Metropolis and this unexpected detour to Apocalypse. Yeah, that one was surprising. I don't think I had ever read that back in the day when I was originally reading Black Ring. But yeah, and this was particularly interesting for me, having spent a number of episodes not too long ago looking at the evolution of Lex across time and media, because this really represents the culmination of all of the different versions that we've seen before, right? He's the mad scientist and the businessman. He's been the disgraced criminal and now returned to prominence. He's in the business suit, but also his power suit. It's like really everything kind of coming together in this ultimate version of Lex. And I mean, I guess that would largely carry over into the New 52 and then, later in Rebirth, of course, he has his heroic turn and all of that. But again, I think this really does represent a very interesting moment in time for the character.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, I mean, I guess in one respect, and I already talked about how I admired that Action Comics stuck to a different starring character for virtually a full calendar year. And I stand by that, of course, but considering the timing of the scheduling, I can also understand the frustration of some people. In fact, I had a couple of customers in the shop at the time who felt like once we learned that the New 52 was coming, that the title was stolen from Superman to a degree. Like, was there a total editorial understanding when Black Ring started? Black Mirror, also another good story, but Black Ring, when it started, was there total editorial understanding that the New 52 would be coming? I don't know. I kind of don't think so, but either way, I don't think that that makes this any less interesting of a story or any worthy of a story to read. Just because the character study on display here, you're absolutely right. It's a total culmination of everything that we've seen with Luther up until this point, and it does serve as, at least eventually, as a nice, I guess, rededication to his place as Superman's ultimate enemy. And their confrontation at the end of this story is one of the best Superman Luther confrontations I've probably ever read. So I think that this was definitely a worthy exercise. And weirdly enough, I mentioned Black Mirror. Detective was being led by Dick Grayson at this time. So this was happening in both action and detective, which is weird to think about.
It's true. I think, what's especially remarkable, I guess, is that not only was Lex the starring character, but like you said, I mean, Superman's off the board. It's not like Lex is driving the action, but he's also going up against Superman every other issue. Superman's really out of it until the very end. So I give them credit for really giving Lex the spotlight. There are, I mean, a ton of great moments that show, not just tell, but show a lot about the character. I think it's in that first issue, right, where one of his underlings is telling him no about one of the experiments that he's conducting, about how much power to use, and Lex fires this guy who proceeds to attack Lex, and of course he's restrained and removed and all of that, and then Lex has him killed at the dinner table by an assassin because he made Lex feel helpless, and Lex can't have that. And I think that's one of the things that makes Lex so fascinating, because there are so many moments where he can be charming. He can take you, you can sort of see his side in certain respects. He's, so capable, so smart, always many steps ahead. There's a lot that can kind of draw you in, but then there are always those moments that show you the utter lack of humanity of the character. And I mean, that was certainly a clear one, but right out of the gate, kind of showing you who you're dealing with this guy.
Well, and the compulsion about not wanting to feel helpless was even more heavily emphasized by the time he encounters death. I mean, he even says as much, if I'm remembering correctly, that I can't feel helpless. But that issue, I think in particular, even though, at the time when we were getting ready to put our orders in, because they had announced that she was going to be a part of that issue several months in advance. And I think there was a prevailing feeling among certain fans that it was just going to be kind of a gimmick. It didn't end up being that at all, at least not in my estimation. I mean, Death helped to provide a perspective on Luther that would be impossible to glean without her level of insight. And the way that he reacts and responds to the confrontation with his own mortality, I think that that's a rather rich addition to the legacy of Lex Luthor as a character, because he doesn't, even in the face of death, his arrogance does not back down, and his pompousness, even, like, she's trying to make him see the uselessness of components of the life that he's lived, and has even recognized the positive contributions that he either did or could have made to the world over the course of his life. But his overriding self-interest is such that he can't even entertain the possibility of a personal nirvana, because he thinks that there's some kind of cost attached to it. Why does he think that? Because if he were in charge of the purse strings, there would be, and he can't see beyond himself. I thought it was a really beautiful representation, actually, of what makes Lex Luthor such a complex villain at the end of the day, and someone who is worthy as a human being of being the archenemy of the most powerful being in existence.
Yes. I mean, that exchange, I think, was telling in so many ways, where, exactly like you said, that, when posed with this idea of paradise, it's like, well, I'd spend forever looking for a catch. And then
Right.
when he gets, to this, final confrontation with death, and he's like, fine, like, send me where you're going to send me. I'll find something to win. It's like that. And that's the character. And that's, I'm going to, we can unpack it more, but I just want to jump to the climax of the story here for a second, because it goes hand in hand with this death issue, I think, of the absolutes that drive this character, the ego, the self-interest, the arrogance. Again, what he articulates to death about rejecting the idea of paradise, about always finding something to win. And then even at the end of the story, we can explain more about how we get there, but ultimately it comes down to he has ultimate power in his hands. And all he has to do, essentially, is stop hating Superman, right? He can't display negative emotion, right? If he can just let it go. And we get to the point where Superman, Clark, is basically pleading with him. He's like, I'm sorry for everything. Like, just do the right thing. And Lex can't. And that's why I love these stories together, because you see the absolutes on both sides of the coin, right? Superman can't not save the little girl who's falling off the balcony. It might result in this dire apocalyptic future. He doesn't know. He can't control that. He can control whether or not he saves that little girl, that life in that moment. On the other side of the equation, you have Lex, and even when he has everything that he claimed he always wanted, right? The ultimate power, the ability to save everyone, do everything he's always claimed, he's always promised, he can't get out of his own way. He can't not hate. And I think when you put these stories together, they show you so much about who these two guys are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a weird way, when I was revisiting Action 900, it struck me as sort of the antithesis to the way that All-Star Superman ends. Because, a story like that's self-contained, has the license and the ability to make more statements of finality relating to these characters that you don't really have in an ongoing environment. But that's not a bad thing. It just adds another wrinkle to what makes these characters tick on an ongoing basis. And even when given absolute power, he can't set aside his pettiness at the end of the day. And I thought that it was really well expressed, especially considering how the story jumps between a few different primary artists, and you have moments from Superman's life that were depicted many years ago and some that were only depicted a couple of years ago. And it takes you through the trajectory of really building up what makes Superman an exceptional human being. And Lex, when confronted with the concept of being inferior because of his own impulses, he just doesn't know what to do, and he freaks out. And he makes what I'm sure he thinks is the only rational response when confronted with that kind of information. And it's just a fascinating character study and a very extremely clear declaration about who both of these guys are on the side of this conflict. So I loved Action 900 just as it's a celebration of Superman, but it's also just it reinforces what makes the rivalry between Superman and Lex Luthor so timeless through a modern lens. And at the end of the day, I think that's what I take away the most from it. I remember telling my boss, we got to up the orders on Action 900. Come on, this is going to be a big mover. It's a big anniversary issue. And I was a little crestfallen when we did have a lot of copies left over, at least after the first week. Over time, though, we got through them all because the word got out that this was a cool story. Not only did it have maybe some more attention-getting stories by people like David Goyer or Jeff Johns or Richard Donner, but the main story, I talked to a lot of people about, they didn't read any of Black Mirror before the finale. And this is only anecdotal, of course, but I just remember having really good conversations with people who just bought that as a collector's item and ended up reading it and realized, hey, this is cool. And I get Superman versus Lex Luthor now.
Yeah, I love the way that played out. And so, when we build to the climax of the story, we find out that once all of these rings or these spheres are converted, they open this doorway to the Phantom Zone, essentially, and this being that was born in the Phantom Zone and was feeding off of the Black Lantern energy emerges, and that's the power that Lex is able to control. Of course, along the way, we also find out that that Brainiac was pulling the strings, but not really, because Lex was ahead of Brainiac. I mean, there are a couple of points in the story where it seems like someone's finally gotten one over on Lex, and it's like, no, I planned for that. Even when the Phantom Zone being comes out, he's like, yeah, I anticipated that. I mean, at a certain point, does that, I don't know, does that totally track? Does it feel like, yep, that's the character of Lex? Or at a certain point, does it feel like, okay, like, he can't, is he that good?
Or no one is that obstinate either. I mean, I just remember being like totally floored at the concept that Bruce Wayne had the capacity to feel utter bliss. And then Lex Luthor took that away from him. It's just like, wow, that's saying something. A guy as tortured as that, who probably on his best day is a lot more tortured than someone like Lex Luthor is. Even his own selfishness could not abide letting anyone else feel that if it meant getting in the way of his core conflict. I like what that says about Luthor's just obsessive obstinacy when confronted with Superman. If only Superman weren't around, he could save the world, but he has to kill Superman first. You're nuts, man. You're nuts. Like, you just put it aside. I can't. Well, that's why Superman takes you down all the time.
Exactly. You mentioning Batman, one of my favorite issues is when he goes to retrieve one of the spheres from Arkham Asylum, and he has his big sit down with the Joker. And it's rare where a comic literally makes me laugh out loud. But there's this amazing exchange where Joker says to Lex, like, oh, if I could just kill Batman, then I could save the world. And Lex has this beat where he's like, oh, like he realizes the Joker is roasting him. It was so funny to me.
Yeah, same here. I mean, and it's totally something the Joker would do as well. I mean, and that's one of the things that I like about portrayals of their relationship in the comics, because who was it? I think it was Mark Waid, who talked about the idea that at the end of the day, every member of the Justice League wants the same thing. But if you put like most of the major villains of the DC universe in the same room, they all want totally different things. But Joker is just such a creature of chaos that if he can dig it at anybody, then he's going to do it. And you could tell that, yeah, just like you said, I mean, getting to like the core constitution of what makes Lex Luthor so obsessive about Superman it's just perfect moment.
For sure. I guess going back to the conclusion here and this confrontation with Superman, where, Superman finally enters the picture and Lex is imbued with all of this power. You mentioned this before, right? Where he shows Superman various moments from his history, right? And makes Superman feel the emotions that, those around him were. For example, when he dies, right? Lex makes Superman feel what Lois felt. The assumption that Lex is making is that Superman is incapable of feeling this kind of emotion himself, right? That he can only pretend or approximate what it would feel like. And the turning point is when, Superman, Clark, thinks of losing his own father, which had happened in the books, again, under the Jeff Johns tenure. And that's, of course, when Lex realizes that Clark is Superman. So we get a few pages of the dynamic that I'm always talking about on this podcast that I want to see more of, where Lex knows, because I think it's fascinating, but we get a few pages of that. I guess it was interesting to me that Lex seemed to genuinely think Superman doesn't feel those things. I guess in my mind, even though Lex might say that, I guess I don't necessarily think he actually believes it, but it seems like he does.
Yeah, it's funny. That didn't occur to me. The idea, at least, that he would always assume that the enemy that he's devoted himself to is equal in all respects. I bought what the story was saying, just because it seems like, even as intelligent as Luthor is, he is still, at the end of the day, extremely deluded and honestly bigoted, right? I mean, Luthor is very much a human supremacist, And I think that that's what it was trying to drive home. I like what you're saying, though, about the idea of him hating Superman in spite of potentially understanding that he's just as capable of feeling anything that a human being does, if not more, right? Like certainly the Grant Morrison approach, that Superman has the ability to see and to feel far more, which is a source of compassion, as opposed to what we normally think of aliens being cold and distant, instead makes Superman warm and empathetic. But in this instance, I don't know, it just seemed like a reinforcement of that human supremacist attitude that really the post-Byrne Luthor has exhibited in spades. But there's a couple of different ways to play that, and I like the concept of what you're talking about, because that reinforces the obstinacy, right? That he accepts, but doesn't still doesn't welcome this guy's encroachment onto his planet. But I do think that there is something to be said about his bigoted attitude toward aliens getting in the way of understanding an essential truth about Superman, which is that he does feel, and he potentially feels more than we do even. And that's a source of strength, and it's something that humanity and the planet have benefited from as a result. But a refusal to see that, when confronted with that, there's something that just feels very truthful about like a total inability to believe it, even when presented with incontrovertible evidence. Like, as someone who seems to appreciate hard facts as much as he does, he really doesn't, because he feels such strong hatred that even when elevated to this more powerful position, he still can't get over. I like what that says about just his arrested development to a degree, because it just reinforces why Superman and Lex Luthor are so diametrically opposed. But I also like the idea. In fact, I would like to see a story more explicitly play with the idea that, oh yeah, he knows that Superman can feel anything that a human being does, but he still doesn't like him, so he's not going to give him the benefit of the doubt.
You made a great case for the way that played out. I think that's the thing with Lex. There are different ways to play it and interpret it, and they, each lend themselves to different things. I think for myself, and especially having done all those Lex episodes, I think I'm always looking for some redeeming quality, some humanity. I think that stems from watching Smallville. Absent that, I don't know that I would necessarily look for that so much, but it's like you watch that show, as we've talked about, and you see everything that he goes through, and from where he starts to where he ends up. And, there's such a tragedy to the character. I thought of Smallville in two instances in Action 900. So the first is at the beginning when I think it's that one, or it might be the one before. Where he and Lois first go into space, and he's talking about how like everything has led him to this. It was like right out of the season 7 finale Arctic of Smallville, where he's confronting Clark in the fortress, and he's like, all my sacrifices, everything my father put me through, it's all been for this. Anyway, that made me think of it. And then when he has that moment with Superman, right, where Superman is recalling Jonathan's death, I forget the exact exchange, but Lex expresses that he was not sorry when his own father died. When, of course, we know he was responsible for his own father dying in the comic and on Smallville. But he expresses something to the extent of essentially jealousy, right? Like that Superman got those parents, whereas Lex got the ones he did. And again, that's, I think, a core theme in Smallville, where you see he wants what Clark has. He wants the kind, nurturing parents. He wants the girlfriend who cares for him. He just wants to be loved. This poor guy. and he can never get it. But, so there were a couple of moments that really called to mind my favorite version of the character from Smallville. So I just wanted to mention those.
No, and I think that that's a perfectly well expressed and well encapsulated expression of another dynamic that sometimes doesn't get the play that it probably deserves. You're right in pointing out how Smallville just hit that Pitch Perfect, particularly in the early seasons before their antagonism really boiled over, right? There was just Rosenbaum did an excellent job of just playing a look in the direction of Clark hugging his parents as having the somber quality that you would expect someone who really craves that to have without wanting to give anything away. It was really well performed. And that moment where in Action 900 that the end of the Brainiac story is revisited, it certainly calls that to mind. But it also, I think at the end of the day, more than giving us a statement about Luthor, is designed to be more of a statement about Superman himself, because Luthor just so easily assumes that everything comes easy to Superman. And when confronted with the totality of his life experiences, he's so astonished that Superman just refuses to break. And I love what that says about Superman's desire and willingness to go the distance, to pursue what he believes in, and to uphold the order that he determines is the correct course of action. I think he says, "Do your worst, Luthor. I won't break." And for the reader, I think it becomes even more emotional, and I'm sure it was the same for you. For any big Superman fan who's given a tour of mostly the character's recent history and all of the trials and tribulations that he's gone through, because we saw his death, of course, and we saw Chris sacrificing himself at the end of Last Son. And Rags Morales, I think, even brought a page in there. And of course, the destruction of his home planet is something that weighs on his heart heavily, even if he may not have been able to fully perceive it. But all of that stuff just contributes to the constitution of Superman as a character. And it also flies in the face of a longstanding perception that Luthor has, certainly in the story, but that also a lot of people have. That Superman's a character that, no pathos, nothing can harm him. He's your grandfather's superhero, and all of those erroneous ideas that people have. These pages show that's not the case. He's someone that has suffered on a different scale, certainly, but he has faced his own crucibles several times over and just comes out stronger for it.
Absolutely. I mean, I know you've hit on this a couple of times about the criticisms that you hear from certain detractors, that we hear from from certain people, and kind of tying this back to one of the things we started with. Yeah, it's been not on the podcast, because the people who are coming on are either Superman fans or at least open, to being a Superman fan. Sure. But it is a weird, unexpected thing to have to defend the character. And, we do that on the show, where we talk about, well, some people say this about the character, here's our response. And, of course you see it online and social media. And it is a weird thing. And I guess our perspectives are very different as fans of the character, but it's like I don't know. It is surprising to me that this character, of all characters, often requires that much of a defense. But we're here to mount one as needed.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about Black Ring that I know we haven't poured through every issue per se, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Oh, I just we mentioned the brief interaction with the Joker, but he actually interacts with quite a few different villains over the course of this story, and it's kind of an all-star lineup. And we don't normally see those kinds of interactions from Luthor's perspective, and that's something that I also find a great deal of value in. Seeing how he interacts with Deathstroke, seeing how he interacts with the Secret Six, because there is an issue of that series that is involved here, and I think it's in the collected editions as well. And even Grodd shows up, or Mr. Mind at the very beginning. I mean, there's a wide cast that Cornell draws from that only enrich the tapestry of villainy across the DC Comics universe that I really appreciated. And not all of the choices of characters that he brings into the fold are totally expected. Even the Joker, to a certain degree, I would actually probably expect to see him more than someone like Mr. Mind, or even potentially someone like Grodd, just because their positions as villains of the DC universe are rather unchallenged. but every single time another character was pulled into this, it just made things so fun. And the balancing of the tones between the fun right before that final declarative statement about both who Superman and Lex Luthor are in the final issue was really, really well balanced. It didn't feel like tones in this story were competing with each other. I thought that it flowed very nicely. And of course, a lot of the emotional expression that you get comes from the beauty and the cleanliness of Pete Woods. I think that he did a phenomenal job over the course of this story, and all of the different collaborators that were brought into the last issue really did make it feel like a celebration of this dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well said. I think the last thought that I guess I have about it is going back to what you were saying a minute ago in 900, where, Lex has that moment with Superman, why won't you break? And again, this idea of the two of them is two sides of the same coin. Cause Lex, similarly, going back to that death issue, he doesn't break, right? He's not gonna beg. He's not gonna plead. He does try to barter, but that's, I think he quickly, understands the reality of the situation there. So again, it's like these two guys who, and especially in this iteration, this post Infinite Crisis era where their past in Smallville was restored. It wasn't as involved as what we saw on the TV show, but there is still this history of them coming from the same place. So again, just the tragedy of where each of them go. And then, Lex ends this story, his ultimate power has dissipated, and with it, the knowledge that Clark is Superman, and he just kind of disappears into one of the spheres, right? And
yeah.
And I've actually not read Reign of the Doomsdays. I don't know if he pops up in that, or is that his last appearance until New 52?
My perception, because I haven't read Reign of the Doomsday in a long time either. I just remember being really disappointed in it when it started, and just kind of felt like this is how we're leaving this era of Superman behind. Batman gets a grand send off all for all intents and purposes, and this is how we're choosing to end I was a little bit bitter at the time. Maybe I should go back and revisit it just for the sake of completeness. But no, as far as I know, this was at least the last major substantive appearance that Lex would have before showing up was in Action number 2, or maybe it was number 1.
I think it was number 1.
Yeah. Oh, he was chugging energy drinks and stuff.
Yep.
Dr. Luther, right? Yeah. How could I forget?
So it's interesting. Like that's his send off before the New 52. But I got to say, I really, really enjoyed reading these stories, and I especially enjoyed this conversation. I thank you so much for taking part. Was there anything else that you wanted to say that we didn't get to before we sign off?
I don't think so. I think we went around the world. All I'll repeat is that in terms of both of these stories, they're absolutely worth revisiting. I'm fortunate to have the 2 hardcover collections of Black Ring. I do not have collections of Camelot Falls, but I might want to track those down now, because that was a far more enjoyable reading experience than I remember. And I think it's because of what we talked about, the ability to sit down and just read that story with the benefit of hindsight, and being able to jump across. They weren't really filler issues, but the issues that didn't have anything to directly do with that. That was a fun experience too. And I think that we both talked about ways that it extracted a lot of really interesting and substantive meaning out of what Superman's place is in certainly in the DCU, but also just in his own corner of it. So no, these are great choices. So thank you again for the invitation. I really appreciate the chance to revisit both of these, because it's not a bad time at all.
No, my pleasure. Really. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. It was great having you on the show, and I look forward to the next time that you and I can podcast together. So thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have to make that happen sooner rather than later.
Very good. All right. So thank you again to Chris. Audience, thank you as always. I really appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back for our next all new episode in 1 week. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the show and receive exclusive additional content, including my DC movie rewatch podcast at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show. Also, be sure to explore the other shows within the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, which is home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, all hosted by yours truly. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. Visit FlatSquirrelProductions.com for more. Thank you all.